Hi everyone, welcome back. Today's video is on price controls. For sure, before watching this video, you want to make sure that you've seen the previous two on how price ceilings and price floors work in a general sense, so that you can get into some of these interesting questions that we'll deal with here regarding the application of such price controls. So with a price control, remember the point is to change that price. We're concerned that either the buyer of the good is paying a price that's too high and we want to bring it down, right? Help out buyers, make products cheaper. The way to do that is with a price ceiling, right? That's a maximum price that's allowed to be charged. The big punchline that we learned in the last video is that whenever you see a price ceiling, the prediction from our model is that it's going to lead to a shortage, right? There's not enough of this good at this lower price ceiling price. And despite this prediction, we still see price ceilings used throughout the country today. Where, you might be wondering? Well, a good example of price ceilings in our contemporary economy is rent control. Rent control. Definitely one of the products that people think generally is too expensive is the price of housing. That's true everywhere, but it's especially true in places like Los Angeles, where we live. This is not a hard argument to make that housing is expensive, and that leads to some negative consequences. And so a lot of people want the government to step in and do something to bring down those prices for apartments and rental units to help out those buyers. So is this a good idea? It's hard to say, but what we can point out with more certainty is that we expect some negative trade-offs are going to have to be made. There's consequences associated with rent control. And so what's happened in those places that have used rent control? One of the things that we can see is that apartment quality oftentimes declines when an area imposes strict rent control. When I say apartment quality, I'm talking about, I don't know how clean apartments are, how easy it is for a tenant to be able to get in touch with their landlord for fixes, the safety of the apartment, things like this. In these places where rent control ordinances have been used, going along with that comes declines in apartment quality. And so why is that? In a normal circumstance, when you don't have rent control, if a landlord is not doing those things to keep up their apartment, if they're not upgrading the appliances, if they're not quick to respond to issues and complaints from tenants, well, then people just leave those apartments, right? If you're not doing your job as a landlord and the market is working well, if you're not holding up your end of the bargain, tenants will just leave and find new apartments. With rent control situations, though, it's another matter. Under rent-controlled situations, we see that there's a shortage. There's a lot of people who wish to live in rent-controlled areas, which are oftentimes desirable and have rent being kept down because of rent control ordinances. So there's lots of people that want to get these apartments and not so many of them available. The consequence is that tenants accept bad behavior from landlords. Landlords recognize this and don't take on those extra expenses to keep up apartment quality. And so because of this artificial shortage, one consequence of rent control is that you can expect apartment quality to go down. All right. Another consequence of rent control, right, one of our best examples of a price ceiling is extortion. So what's that? Extortion is when landlords will try to stretch extra money out of those tenants, even if they're not legally permitted to do so. There's examples of landlords saying, yes, we will comply with the law by charging the rent-controlled rent, but above and beyond that, there's this extra fee that you're going to need to pay in order to move in here. And so they're just taking advantage, trying to squeeze extra money out of tenants, just like with apartment quality that we were talking about a moment ago. Under normal circumstances, that won't fly. If your landlord is trying to squeeze you for extra money, you just go find a new apartment. It's a different case, though, if there's a shortage of these apartments. So extortion takes place. We also see black markets in some cases when rent control laws are put into place. Black market is any sort of economic activity, people buying and selling stuff outside of the confines of what is legally allowed. In the context of housing markets, this black market then would take the form of subletting or renting out units in a way that is not permitted by local laws. Finally, then, I didn't put it on the board, but another negative consequence of rent control is that we remove the price as the mechanism for deciding who gets to live in a particular area. Again, in the absence of rent control, those people who move into desirable areas are those people who are willing and able to pay the price. Okay, and that has some unfairness to it, but that's the mechanism. That's the way that we decide who gets to live in Beverly Hills or Santa Monica or whatever. With rent control, though, there's lots of people lined up for not so many available apartments, and you can't raise the price, so landlords have to find a different way to decide how they're going to allocate that apartment, who they're going to rent to when they have a stack of applications. Rent-controlled areas oftentimes see informal connections then becoming more important. Who you know goes a long way in terms of finding an apartment rather than everyone having the same chance to pay that price. And again, I can understand that there's unfairness to maybe both of those processes, using price and who can pay the highest price versus relying upon informal connections. Again, the point that I'm trying to make is that we've changed the mechanism here by which we're allocating the good. Okay, so those are some of that's an example of a price ceiling. Rent control is the best one. Turning to the other price control that we've been learning about in this unit, a price floor, we also have a really good textbook example. The clearest example of a price floor that we have is the minimum wage. This is usually a really interesting one for students because a lot of students are either working minimum wage jobs or not so far removed from it. This works in a very similar fashion to the textbook example of a price floor that we were talking about in the last video. Right? Keep in mind that with labor markets, right, so the market for workers, that supply curve represents the behavior of all of the workers out there. So it's the supply of workers, and the demand curve represents firm behavior, demand for workers. And so supply and demand are kind of flipped in this market, in the sense that usually demand is related to household behavior, you and me, and supply is related to businesses. But in labor markets, it's backwards, right? In a labor market, the supply of labor is related to household behavior. The demand for labor is measuring firm behavior. Okay, so the textbook example of a price floor that we learned about in that last video, right, predicted that when we raise that price up above the equilibrium, it's going to lead to a surplus. Too much of this good at the price dictated relative to the amount that people want to buy. Right? In the context of labor markets, that has another name though. Right? A surplus here is simply unemployment. So this is the big thing that a big criticism that people offer with respect to minimum wage laws, that you pull up wages higher than they would be otherwise in an attempt to help workers, but it can lead to this consequence of actually increasing unemployment, and by doing so harming the very people that the policy is designed to help. Okay. This is the more complicated issue though. And the reason why I say that is because when researchers have gone in and studied the effects of minimum wage laws in recent years, what they're finding is there's not dramatic unemployment as has been suggested in the past. This is something that labor economists disagree about. And so we need to be really careful about how we're presenting this here. Minimum wage laws, there's not evidence that they create widespread unemployment. There's some debate on how much unemployment they do actually cause. In terms of the reason for this, the rationale for why you would see unemployment with minimum wage laws, it has to do with what happens to incentives as we increase the price of hiring workers. Firms are going to do things to avoid paying workers higher wages, right? And so with a minimum wage, you've got firms now having a greater motivation to use machinery in place of workers. You can predict that if minimum wage laws are put into place, firms are going to use more machinery in place of workers wherever they can. So that might mean like self-checkout kiosks or something like this. That would be a good example of this. You guys have all seen fast food restaurants in recent years where you can order right there on a touch screen. That's the sort of thing that I'm trying to reference here, where if you're paying workers more, it gives firms more of a reason to take those steps and invest in machinery instead. Firms can try to move. Different businesses have varying ability to do this, but if the production of the good in question can be moved to another city or another state or another country, and by doing so that business can avoid paying workers more, well then you might expect a higher minimum wage to give firms more reason to move. And that can result in unemployment in a local area. Of course, some jobs are not mobile like that. For example, getting a haircut, or getting a tattoo, or having your car repaired. Those sort of jobs can't pick up and move to the next state over if minimum wage law or wages are going up. And so certain jobs are more mobile than others. Firms sometimes will reduce hours for workers when they become obligated to pay more because of higher wages. If you're paying more, then just like we talked about with the previous examples, there's a greater incentive to try to avoid those costs. All right, guys. Any questions on this? You can link them below. Email me if you have questions on this, or link them below. That's all for this one. I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye now.